Wow, nice. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Cranbrook Art Museum. It's a little bright. It's okay. My name is Lila Catelier. I'm the curator of public programs here at the Art Museum. I'm very excited to welcome you today to the conversation Poster Art in the Spirit of Revolution. This conversation today is at the end of an exhibition which is called A Modernist Regime, Cuban Mid-Century Design. This exhibition has been the first major museum exhibition of Cuban design that has ever been mounted in the United States. And for that matter, much of the work that's in this exhibition has not been seen outside of Cuba unless it was purchased at a boutique at the time that it was made somewhere in Europe. And the Ostwald posters have also not been shown as a group necessarily in the same way, and we're so excited to welcome Lincoln Cushing, the founder of Vox Populi, to speak to you about his collection that we borrowed for the show. Quite excited about that. And then joining him afterwards will be our director, Andrew Satake Blauvelt, who will give some perspective on the research for the exhibition, the publication, and some more context for the work that Lincoln will show. And then Danielle Aubert, who is a graphic designer and professor of graphic design, will join us with a little bit about Detroit and some printing that has happened in Detroit at around the same time to sort of bring the context all together for this conversation. So without further ado, just because it's actually kind of hard to look at a very dark room like this and remember your notes, I'll say please join me in welcoming Lincoln Cushing.
Wow, it is dark.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, can we dim these lights a little bit? I don't need these lights. Hi, thank you all. Thank you very much for hosting this exhibition. I have to say, it's an honor to see these posters, which are usually relegated to being just mere communist propaganda, as serious design. And in the context of a country that was struggling to define itself, it's a powerful fusion. And so I really thank you for that respect that you are showing to these pieces of work. So let me jump into this. If I go too long, just poke me. But what I want to talk about is the spirit of revolution. I'm not going to defend the Cuban Revolution, although I could. But what I'm going to talk about is the higher level meaning of these posters as graphics and sort of ways to interpret them that you probably hadn't thought of before. First, I want to give an acknowledgement to indigenous occupation. We here are on land that was formerly occupied by Native people who used to mine and manufacture copper thousands of years ago, like the giant roof that's on one of these buildings. Here are 3 posters from Ostwald that are about honoring the indigenous ancestors before Columbus came, occupied the island, and after decimating them as enslaved laborers, began the slave trade with Africa. It was the need for black workers to replace the indigenous workers. Which, sugar is a brutal occupation. And people died doing it, and it transformed the world. But these are 3 posters that are all for honoring the resistance of indigenous people in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so I want you to think a little bit about what posters are. A lot of people just think, oh, political poster. Well, it's an agitational message, and propaganda is one term that's used to describe it. But if you're supporting the cause, this is a great one from the Spanish Civil War, soldiers of paper and ink alongside those of flesh and blood. I've also heard them described as paper bullets. And they're really, really powerful. Part of the reason that I get passionate about this stuff is I met a lot of these artists. This is not just some sort of PhD dissertation where I read about it and write about it. I mean, I talked to these people, I hosted some of these people at my house, and to really sort of see what it was like for them in Havana to be functioning as graphic artists making this sort of social justice artwork was transformative for me. These people are just amazing human beings. They're dead, but their spirit lives on. Part of the context of all this stuff is that after the revolution, the commercial infrastructure that we are used to, you drive down the street and there's giant billboards and there's news and there's commercial messages blasting in your face. After the revolution, that stopped. And all of a sudden, you start to have a whole different layer of what is it that you see on the street, what are the messages, who makes the messages. It's a very, very different visual environment. So there are three main publishers that were producing a lot of the posters in Cuba. And the ones that you see upstairs, OSPAL is but one of them. The ones that many people are more familiar with are the Cuban film posters that are just gorgeous. And Editora Política, which is the Cuban publishing arm of the Communist Party. They did all sorts of posters about everything from, recycling bottles to joining the sugar harvest. Massive general posters, billboards, all sorts of material, books, all sorts of publishing in the service of promoting revolutionary goals. But we're going to focus on OSPAL. They closed down in 2019. They basically ran out of steam. The world has changed a lot since 1967. And so let's look at just a couple of posters that you don't see upstairs, just because I want to show you the range of styles. This is just the tip of the iceberg. They produced almost 400 different images. The stylistic range is just incredible. I mean, one of the themes, for example, that you see is domestic resistance to foreign forces. And you use modern weapons in the hands of indigenous people. There's a whole hierarchy of what the weapons are. If it's an aircraft carrier, well, it's imperialism. If it's a handheld weapon, it's resistance. There are lots of clues that you start to see as you unravel the meaning of the posters. But even just the shaping, this is like, who else in the world would make a poster like this one on the right? The stylistic range and diversity is staggering for a country of 10 million people. Then you see posters, you go, oh my God, that's a OSPAL poster? Well, yes and no. It was produced through OSPAL, but it was really produced by a North Korean artist. The Cubans did some designs, the North Koreans didn't like it. They said, fine, give us your own. This is a North Korean design for a poster on Korea. This is a Cuban poster about Korea. Dramatically different approaches to design. I like the concept of positive and negative space because I look at history and I look at what's missing. This compact graphic of an American eagle being defeated and coming down is just so strong and so concise. It's Cuban. It really reveals some of the power of the trends that they had, and these people all worked with each other. This is a small community in Havana. They all talk to each other, they know each other. Many often they work with other artists and other agencies. This is not insular. They work together and talk to each other. It was a collegial. So I want to talk about a couple of things that are harder to visualize because you're not actually looking at it. One is, how did people hear about these? Isn't Cuba this country far away that we're not supposed to be able to go to? Of course, everybody in the world can go to it except us because we're not allowed to go there. And in fact, the law is a Treasury Department law. You can travel there for free, and you're not breaking a single law. The law is against spending U.S. money there because we don't want our money to go support communism. But, did it jump? So one way that images travel is by airplane. This was a guy that was on a plane that got hijacked. And he shows up at the Havana airport, and he sees these posters on the wall. He gets all excited. So this shows up. Oh, it's jumping on me. He's excited. Well, this shows up in the newspaper. They go, oh my God, they're promoting communist propaganda to our youth. He was thrilled to death. Well, this same poster, this is Alfredo Roscar, 1968, with LBJ's face on bombs dropping on Vietnam. It's a Cuban film poster. It's a really strong, powerful, compact poster. But one way that people saw them was you could find ways to travel to Cuba and bring posters back. One way was magazines. Ramparts magazine, which was published in the Bay Area, published several articles on Cuban posters. This one was about René Medeiros, who is a couple of posters in this exhibition. He traveled to Vietnam twice to see what the war was like on the ground. It's jumping on me. And he did these incredible giant paintings that were then turned into screen prints, that were even then turned into a series of postage stamps for the Republic of Cuba about honoring the solidarity with the Republic of Vietnam and the struggle against the war there. Books. There was a really important book. Susan Sontag did the essay, Art Revolution, in 1970. But there wasn't a book until I came out with this book in 2003, a giant gap, which staggers me. I don't know why. Nobody did. But I had done some research, and I was approached by a publisher, and I said, sure, let's do a book. And it covers the broad range, of material. And so this is how people found out about these images as well. Exhibitions. There were some exhibitions that started in 74 in the United States. This was in San Francisco. You look at the image, and it's not a particularly revolutionary image, but they did have some really strong posters in there. But you want to draw people in. You don't want to scare people away. This also traveled to New Mexico. But Juan Fuentes, for example, is a Bay Area graphic artist who's making art to this day. I mean, a lot of the people that are involved in this world, this is what they do. And you don't just sort of do it for a few years and then go off and sell real estate. You do this because you love it, it's your passion. So that's sort of part of the way that people saw these images. How do you first see these things? Because they're in a foreign land. But now I want to talk about, well, what influence did they have? And there's a lot. Okay. Here's a poster about Vietnam. I love this one. The words in multiple languages braided together to form this basket to stop a bomb. You don't even have to say it's a US bomb. We all know it's a US bomb. Stopping a unified Vietnam. Well, it was instantly reproduced in the United States. They changed it a little bit, but they said this is a great poster, a great image. The Cuban stuff was easily shiftable. The simple graphic design lent itself far more than the Chinese poster to being repurposed. So here's one that was done the same year. Here's that same poster I showed you. Well, in 1972, they had to switch the face to Richard Nixon. They put a flag on it just to sort of make sure that we knew it was a US bomb dropping on Vietnam. But they did an incredibly good job of matching the typography. This is really an homage to this Cuban poster and elevating it to the current moment. Beautifully done. I still don't know who did it. There's a huge amount of research to be done on this. A lot of the stuff, you could look at the posters upstairs, change the words a little bit and say it was produced in Ann Arbor, or it was produced in New York, or Albuquerque. I mean, the messaging alignment is staggering to me. This is something I didn't quite absorb until recently, but how the same themes just keep coming up. Chicano artists said, we don't want to fight in Vietnam. Black artists said, we don't want to fight in Vietnam. So you start to see this commonality of messaging in the late 60s into the very early 80s, sort of the long 60s. But for example, you look at the Ostpal poster on the right, well, that was what Malakias drew from in making this poster about Vietnam and Aslan. So the images were out there, people used them and recycled them. A poster that would come out of Cuba would then be pretty instantly transformed by the first independent left press in the country in Ithaca, New York, Glad Day Press. They changed the color background. Way in the far right corner, there's a little IWW bug, but they did it as an act of solidarity, and then they distributed it themselves. So these messages and these posters in various forms were recirculated not only within the United States, but outside the United States. The Black Panther Party, Emory Douglas, produced this graphic, which was instantly picked up and altered by Lázaro Abreu in 1968. He changed it a little bit, but basically it's the same concept. And this was a time when people weren't freaking out about copyright. If it was within the movement, it was okay to share. It was fine. It was actually good that it was shared. You didn't worry about somebody because nobody's making money on you. This is promoting an ideology that everybody cared about at the time. And so if it was being ripped off, it wasn't. It was being liberated and shared. There were no hard feelings about this. This wonderful poster, which I think you've got upstairs, got picked up several times. This one was done, if you notice, it changed from Afro-American people to African people, is the subject. This was done by the Venceremos Brigade, which would send groups of North Americans down to Cuba to help with the sugar harvest, to sort of promote sort of inter-solidarity between these two countries. And then it even got picked up by a black nationalist organization. So these images, again, they're very strong, they're very replicable, and got used many, many times within this country. Jane Norling, her poster's upstairs. Well, she continued to make posters similar to that. I mean, she's a graphic designer. She left the Bay Area just a couple of years ago, but she would design posters for political campaigns and for educational campaigns, very much in the same theme. These are public service messages. This is what she does, and she happened to be in Cuba for 3 months, and she did a poster, and she was about to turn it in for production. He said, well, put your name on it. She said, isn't that kind of bourgeois to put your name on something? And they said, oh, no, we do it. So it's like this myth that there's this monolithic sort of bureaucracy that just churns out propaganda was utterly deflated in her eyes. She goes, oh, my God, I'm working with these people. They want me to put my name on it. So it was moving to her that they honored the artist. This graphic just goes deeper and deeper. I mean, I love this one of my favorite president, Richard Nixon, with a bunch of Vietnamese at the top. Well, it got picked up by Emory Douglas on the cover of the Black Panther newspaper. Then, more recently, it got picked up when Spike Lee produced The Five Bloods. He asked Emory to recycle that image, to turn it again one more time. But again, we're going back to Cuba. And it even shows up like in Albuquerque for a newspaper. And then it shows up in Ireland. I mean, it's this concept of this very clever abstraction of how to deal with, a fascist president who is out of control in the head. Oh, wait, is that possible? Okay, I'll stop there. But these images are so strong that they have an incredible life of their own. We're talking the spirit of the revolution. I helped to produce an exhibition in Vietnam several years ago. Rene Medeiros' grandson, who happened to be working at a job in Vietnam, said, hey, they'd love to see some of my grandfather's stuff here. So they did an exhibition of Rene Medeiros' stuff, and then they had Vietnamese artists do their interpretations that were riffing off of this stuff from Cuba about Vietnam. So it starts to take on these multiple layers. I love this type of graphical set based on Rene Medeiros' graphics. I mean, this is an homage to a Cuban artist who was supporting the struggle for independence in Vietnam. And it just keeps going on. So there's a cycle that happens that shows how powerful these are. These aren't just one-offs and it's gone and it's propaganda. Unless it shows up at a museum, you'll never see it again. You're seeing it now. Sometimes things do get ripped off. Let's talk Shepard Fairey, okay? I saw this graphic. This is from my book, okay? This had never been reproduced before it was in my book. Oh, let's go back because it gets fun. I saw this, I go, wait a second. I saw this T-shirt, and I go, what is going on here? So fortunately, this was produced by a Canadian company, and Canada has diplomatic relations with Cuba. And so they responded instantly when I said, hey, wait a second, you got something funky going on here. And so they quickly got a hold of Shepard. Shepard got a hold of me, and to his credit, he said, gee, didn't mean to, I wasn't trying to do any harm, it's hard to get a hold of Cuba, da-da-da. He ended up paying some money to the Medeiros estate. He backed off really quickly, to his credit. But people assume that they can take this stuff and run with it. Well, I just want to show the long legacy of this stuff. And here, there's a direct through line from René Medeiros' work to what I would argue is probably the most important political campaign poster, presidential campaign poster in this period. And you look at this stuff, and Shepard admits this. He says, yeah, that's where I got my inspiration from. So the work that you're seeing upstairs that was done in the 70s and 80s has continued to flower through this day. There's even, posters now with this. This set an iconographic standard for this type of design that's really based on René Medeiros' work. But this stuff is still dynamite. I mean, this exhibition is rare because I was hired at the end of last year to curate an exhibition in New York City based on their own collection of posters, of Ostpal posters. I said, great, I'll do that. And I did it, and it was canceled at the last minute, literally weeks before it was about to be mounted, because my curatorial description of the content was not neutral enough. Okay, Cuban propaganda posters, neutral. What do you really mean? I still don't know what the answer to that is. They will not tell me. What's neutral? You can figure it out for yourself. But this stuff is still controversial. You're lucky that nobody has given you trouble. And in some ways, that would be interesting because you'd have some dialogue. This is all about dialogue. We want dialogue. We want dialogue with Cuba. I am not defending what's going on with artists in Cuba now by showing these works. Artists never should be censored. That totally backfires on you. It blows up. But, governments are governments, and governments can behave badly. So I support artists in every capacity to show their work, to survive as artists, but also the spirit of the Cuban Revolution and the artwork that's produced during this incredibly powerful period has a powerful, powerful legacy that is reflected in part of what you see upstairs. Here's me on my brother's shoulders with a 48-star flag, with a U.S. warship on a hospitality visit to Havana Harbor. Those cars are still there. But I have skin in this game, and Cuba is really important to me, but the broader spirit of the work that came out of Cuba during the long 60s is indisputable and worth 1,000 dissertations. So this is me, this is what I do. You can email me, you can contact me through here. Thank you.
We're gonna try to fix the advancement problem. It might be a touch screen. Were you touching the screen? Sometimes that shocks me when I was like, oh yeah, it's a touch screen. I'm Andrew Blauvelt. In one of my former past lives, I was a professor of graphic design and historian of graphic design. And what I'd like to do, just briefly, is to put into some greater context the work that you're seeing upstairs with regards to the Ostpal poster series. Let's see. This would be typically what you might expect out of an authoritarian regime. Is a house style. This happened under Stalin in the Soviet Union and under Mao in China, communist China. And that style is social realism. Realism is the preferred technique or representational technique, not abstraction, for instance, which was thought to be, elitist. And then, of course, depictions around national kind of heroicism. And what's remarkable about the poster series and Ostpal in particular is what Lincoln mentioned is the graphic eclecticism, the range of styles that you're seeing upstairs. So I did include some source references because what you're seeing upstairs is a reciprocity and exchange of styles that were happening simultaneously around the world in the 1960s. including a major influence was Swiss poster art. The Swiss preferred, they often use a lot of typography and photography mixed together, and a very strong and dramatic photography, sort of out of a Bauhaus tradition of new perspectives on subjects, such as these two posters. But within the Ozpol context, you also see that kind of reduction. The idea of the silhouette is really important. In this one, the colonizer's pit helmet is being pierced by the arrow. This is kind of a William Tell kind of moment. Or the negative impression of the body being shot through, or even the firearms itself. And I think Lincoln mentioned this as well. In a lot of the early Oswald posters, there's a reference to the indigenous culture of whatever country they were supporting. And I don't know if we should explain a little bit further, but Ozpol was an organization in solidarity with the colonial and post-colonial struggles of peoples in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and that's an acronym. And that's why it has the name Ozpol. So these posters would be developed by Cuban designers for circulation around the world in solidarity with other people's causes. And so within the recipient's country, there's often this recourse to pre-colonial, pre-contact iconography, particularly anything referencing kind of warrior culture or war culture in that pre-contact moment, to skip over in a way, to erase the idea of the colonial imprint in that country, to link struggle from pre-colonial struggle. The same would be true for Polish poster art, also in the 1960s and 70s. These are some classic examples of that, again, using photography, but in a very abstract way. And then in solidarity, the use of photography combined with strong typographic messaging in causes both in Africa and in particularly South Africa in the 1980s against the apartheid regime in South Africa. As Lincoln mentioned, there was a great reciprocity between the Black empowerment, the Black Power movement in the United States and the U.S. Civil Rights movement. In particular, the work of Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panthers and essentially their creative director and art director for their newspaper, which also included within its format a large full-page, essentially poster. And so you'll see a lot of these messages and the techniques are used, the simplified graphic line drawing style, for instance. And then in the case we have upstairs of a direct, a kind of collaboration, if you will, between those two creators, Pedron and Douglas. The work on the right is, it's not George Floyd. It's actually a different George Jackson, who was killed in prison when he was imprisoned after a kind of rebellion at the prison, commemorating his death. Other influences included op art, which in the 1960s would have had a strong influence and very graphic by its very nature. And this transmits really well in terms of the Ozpol posters upstairs and the solidarity with the fight in Angola, and also commemorating Che Guevara's death when he's killed in Bolivia, leading guerrilla fighters there against the government. But this idea of op art and this idea of radiating out consumes a lot of energy and a lot of excitement, but also a lot of influence. Pop art was directly an influence for a lot of the artists. The one that we're showing on the left is Raul Martinez, who was an artist as well as a designer. And this is actually one of his paintings from 1972. So he, like a lot of these artists, a lot of the designers were actually artists and then acting as designers under Ozpol. It's kind of one of the official jobs that you could have is putting your skills to work for the communist government. Of course, Andy Warhol would be another kind of influence. For a lot of the artists, the Mexican muralists were a big influence because they came to kind of recognition in terms of the national war and their fight for the liberation of Mexico. So this is in the aftermath. People like Diego Rivera, of course, but also Orozco was a huge influence on someone like Raul Martinez. This is a poster that he did. So I showed you a painting. This is a poster commemorating the anniversary of the revolution in Cuba. And in the case of Rosgaard, who was essentially the kind of organizer for OSPOL poster design, a kind of creative director, if you will. One of his most famous works, which we call Guerrilla Jesus, this was in reference to liberation theology as a movement among priests in Latin America, a struggle for social justice in Latin America. Another big influence was Japanese modernism. Workshops and exchanges took place, a different kind of modernist approach coming out of a different culture, which you can see remnants of in the piece actually that was cropped in Lincoln's last slide, but also this poster for, again, commemorating Che Guevara. And then, as Lincoln was saying, that this continues today because there's a whole, multiple generations that have succeeded since the 1960s. And a lot of the contemporary artists are facing oppression inside Cuba under a new series of laws that were mandated by the government. Fidel Castro's brother took over power. And basically, you need to register to be an artist, and the government will decide you are an artist, and you can practice as an artist. So it's a very extreme example, and they also have a huge crackdown on any forms of dissent, and artists are, of course, known for their dissenting voices in these kind of cultures. And so some artists are imprisoned, and then other artists have been imprisoned and forced into exile. So we had a show that, unfortunately, is not up right now because we had to take it down early to change over our exhibitions. But this is one of those artists who grew up around a lot of these OSPOL posters. So you'll see some influence there. And then almost classically here, or more directly, on the left is a famous poster for calling for the freedom for Angela Davis by Felix Bachon. And a more contemporary example by Lillian Dooley, who's calling for freedom for Luis Manuel, who is one of these artists who's in prison in Cuba. And of course, the ripple effects of this, as Lincoln mentioned, were its impact on American anti-war posters in the United States, especially in the Bay Area, produced some of the most kind of iconic of these posters, using techniques like silkscreen, doing it very cheaply. And I always like to point out to the nerds in the audience, the paper that's being used on the poster on the left is actually tractor feed paper from, if you remember, the early computer days. And so this would have been a kind of form of recycling. The poster on the right is actually on the back of, I believe, a brochure or calendar, so it's the back cover that was blank. The funny side story for all this recycling was that was it Reagan, who was governor of California? He investigated, they wanted to crack down on the university students, and because they were university students doing this at Berkeley, using the tools and equipment of the university, he thought they could go after them for unauthorized use of materials. But since so many of the things were recycled, they couldn't really win their argument in court. So, sidebar note. So that was just my attempt to try to contextualize what a lot of the influences that are going back and forth with these posters that you're seeing in Cuba. And just to reiterate, as I did upstairs, that Cuban graphic design has always been recognized almost from its inception as being exceptionally excellent and unique. And that came through the film posters, but also the posters done by the government for the people, as well as through these OSPOL posters. So I'd like to turn it over to Danielle, who kind of will place it in some kind of contemporary and local context for us in Detroit. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Danielle Aubert, and I just have a couple of slides to talk about. So I a professor of graphic design, and I was at Wayne State for many years and did a lot of research into Detroit's history. So I was just going to kind of talk a little bit about some of what was going on at the same time, or around this time in Detroit. And the work that I had researched was on the Detroit Printing Co-op, and you can see the union label on the left, which is from the Detroit Printing Co-op. And then that kind of led me to finding out some information about Black Star, which was the media arm of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. So and that is a subject that someone I know is actually writing about now, like doing more research, because that's been harder to find information about. But I want to say, I'll just give a little bit of background about what this is. The Detroit Printing Co-op was like a print shop that was operating in the 70s, basically from like 1970 to 1980 in Detroit, and everything they printed, they put that bug on the left. And to tie it actually a little bit back to this current context, when I first started researching this, the only information I could find was something that Lincoln Cushing had written on this like blog post. You know, it's a very short text, and it was about union labels and what they signify, how they sort of provide information about the type of labor that was used in producing a label. And then that was the example that was alongside the article. And I was like, this is a crazy example, actually, because it's talking about abolishing the wage system, which, you know, as a union member myself and like a union activist, I would hope for that level of militancy in my own union, but that's not normal. So, so that's the Detroit Printing Co-op. But at the same time as they were working, or when they began, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit also started up, and so I'm sure there are many people here who know more than me about that history, but that was a group of militant, radical Black workers in the auto plants, and they started in Dodge, Maine, which is where the workers were represented by the UAW, and had an analysis of their power within the union and within the plant as being able, as Black workers, to shut down the plant if they just unionized, if they just sort of organized on their own. And it kind of, that like class analysis and sort of like worker analysis of themselves sort of took hold in other plants around Detroit and other places around Detroit and became known as the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And they had connections with the Black Panther Party, or kind of like were in conversation with other movements, but it was a very like Detroit specific thing. And they had this media arm, I would call it, called Black Star, where they did printing and typesetting. They had a bookstore, and then they were also distributing films. And the League had sent people to Cuba, like as a delegation at a certain moment. But I unfortunately do not know like that much to talk about that history. But I did want to talk about this one poster that kind of echoes actually a bit about what both Lincoln and Andrew were talking about, because the graphic production in Detroit, you know, was really interesting. It's not always like, they weren't, well, I don't want to say they weren't graphic. There were interesting graphic designers here, but a lot of times it was very practical. And this particular poster was printed at the Detroit Printing Co-op. But it was, I'll show the, yeah. So it was printed at the Detroit Printing Co-op, which was like, where they had an offset press, but it was probably printed at the behest of Helen Jones, who was a printer at Black Star, where they had like more sophisticated typesetting equipment at Black Star, which was on Finkel Street, but then they had a larger printer, physical printer at the co-op, which was in Southwest Detroit. So when I was doing this research into the co-op, I was like, this graphical language is so different from everything else that I was seeing coming out of Detroit. And it turns out, I can't even remember how we figured this out. I feel like it was a combination of Google reverse image search and like talking to some people who remembered what was going on, but it's actually a reproduction of a Chinese poster from 1964, which I think when I realized that, it did kind of blow my mind, but I think hearing what Lincoln was talking about makes sense, is that it was just practical. Like, people wanted this poster and they wanted this image, and there was no sense of ownership. It's very different from Shepard Fairey, who was like going to put it on a T-shirt and, you know, sell images. So people that I've talked to remembered seeing this poster just like up in movement spaces in the 70s. So it just has, so it's like the same image, but then below it, it says U.S. imperialism, get out of Africa, in 3 languages. And then I also thought it was resonant of the image that was shown earlier, that was the Lazaro Abreu Padron image with Emory Douglas. So, so it's also like in terms of what is being represented, like a woman with a African woman with a child on her back with a gun. And then just to say that also that poster was used, so this is an image from the print co-op. That's Peter Werby, if anybody knows Peter Werby from the Fifth Estate. So, and then in the background, I'm actually not sure the name of the woman who's standing next to him, but behind them is Lorraine and Freddie Perlman. But you can see the color separations for the poster that's against the wall. So that poster was also the poster they used to kind of teach printing within the print shop, like supposedly. So like they would, one of the sort of like anecdotes about the print shop was that Freddie Perlman, who operated the printer, like taught himself to print and like taught himself color separation. So there's the 4-color printing process, the CMYK. Printing process, but he like taught himself and like in reverse how to do it. So they would show, like they separated out all the colors and then you'd have to kind of put those on top of one another to print. So you can see the poster again up in the background. So that's the last image I had from the co-op, but I just did want to note that like this idea around reproduction is really interesting. The other thing I think to note about the OSPAL posters was, and the fact that it was, I think that it's interesting that it was the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and Black Star that asked for that poster to be reprinted, that sort of, initiated that, because there's it sort of resonated with the kind of internationalism that people were thinking about. Like the workers in Detroit were identifying with the, workers around the world who were fighting for liberation. And so as I was, Lincoln also mentioned how it's hard to show this work today. I mean, it's political work. It's not just, we can talk about the form and all of that, and I think it is important for us to talk about it, but it's political, it's taking a statement, it's taking a position vis-a-vis the government, vis-a-vis imperialism and colonialism. And so, at the time, so when I've been looking up work on Black Star, which is harder to find, one of the 3 things I found was a pamphlet about a film, 2 documentaries about Gaza that they were circulating in 1971. And they were the sole U.S. distributor of this documentary. And I was like, it's just kind of like everything changes and everything stays the same. It was this moment of just looking at this work and being like, if you want to talk about work that's hard to show, here's work that's hard to show. But also, OSPAL at that time was also making a number of works that were also in solidarity with the Arab people, in solidarity with Gaza, with Syria. So I think, I think as we're kind of looking at this, it sort of represents this one moment of internationalism that kind of circulated or coursed through Detroit at the same time. Yeah, that's all I can say. But so I hope we can kind of continue the discussion and look forward to the questions and comments. Thanks, everyone. Should I put it up on image? I'll leave it up on an. How about that one?
Okay, I flip mine on. Is it working? Oh, it is. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Lincoln. Since I began working on this exhibition with our co-curators Laura Ma and Abel Gonzalez-Fernandez, I've noticed much more interest in the work of OSPAL. Like, we started on these things about 3 or 4 years ago, but we were chatting a little bit about that earlier with Lincoln. I was going to ask Lincoln, you've been working on this material, but for decades, right? And so is this like a cyclical thing, or is this new? What would account for the new interest, do you think?
I can't explain it. It's just, I've had these posters for decades. Nobody has asked to borrow them until this year, when you and another institution said, can we borrow posters for this? And I go, Okay? I mean, I've done tiny exhibitions at local cultural centers, but nothing at a major institution. And this third one that I was asked to curate in New York would have been a third. There would have been 3 shows of Ostball posters this year.
And there was one in London,
For some
too.
bizarre reason, I cannot explain it.
Yeah, there was one at the
sunspots.
Barbican in London. I don't know if you saw that one or not. They were also showing it.
But it's there's for some reason there's and again with the cycle of an exhibition at a major gallery takes a while.
Yeah.
So it's not like you just thought of this last week. So something was in the wind. Who knows? I can't explain it, but all of a sudden it's kind of exciting to see it getting so much traction.
I was going to ask Danielle a similar question because you're with students in the way that we're not on a daily basis. And it seems like there's interest, like during the pandemic, I remember dropping into design history chats online. And they weren't talking about Ostpol specifically, but you felt like it could belong there. And I was wondering if you've seen the same thing.
Yeah, well, I think what I've seen is, because I teach the history of graphic design, and it's just the way we teach the history, what we recognize and what we uplift in the history of graphic design has changed dramatically for the better, in the last 10 to 15 years, because it used to be that William Tell poster, like the
Right.
Swiss posters that you would show, and it was really like a European, Western European history. Maybe you would talk about the Polish solidarity posters, but I think that as people have started to just like take a broader view of what belongs in the history of graphic design, I think people are looking at these like rich like archives and troves, and Ostpol is like an obvious one because I think it was so. They had a specific distribution method. I mean, they were getting the posters out, and they're also, even though like you're saying they're different artists, they're marked as all belonging to this political project. So that's. Yeah, they're branded.
Branding on multiple levels, right?
But
mean,
yeah,
the
and so I think people are
attribution.
just looking for, people are kind of putting together these histories, which is kind of like in Detroit, what I was trying to do too, because I was teaching at Wayne State, and I'd be like, we don't have to just think about the New York or LA-based history
Right.
of graphic design. There's obviously people here, Cranbrook is here, so
Right.
so you start to kind of piece together these things, and then you try to find information, and a lot of what Lincoln has been archiving is really valuable for that.
Exactly, yeah. Lincoln's archive is much larger than the Ostball collection.
I mean, let me add a part to that, which is sometimes people didn't know what they didn't know. And so, like I said, when I went to Havana and I asked them how many posters have you done, and they said, we're not sure. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to start to do this. And I started to shoot Kodachrome slides. This was the standard for documenting images. And I started to get images from here and from there. And I started to build up a the first digital catalog raisonné of Ostpol's work. And I showed it to them, and they were thrilled to see their own work, again, being treated with respect and scholarly attention. And then when I started, and I've got these online now, and so people can go and see, what do you have on Angola? What do you have on Vietnam? So the explosive digital presence of material that used to be analog only, I think is contributing to people realizing that there's a lot more out there in this graphic arts universe than they were even aware of. So I think that's probably part of the answer.
Not to just linger on this question
No,
forever,
that's
but
fine.
I also think just having a book about a topic makes such a difference. So like when you publish that book, I actually had that Susan Sontag book, but like you said, it's old and it's kind of worn out. But then if you kind of come out with a book, you can't really it has an impact, especially for those of us who are teaching, because, for instance, I remember when there was a catalog that came out about Emory Douglas's work for the Black Panther Party, and that was like 2008, because I had started teaching, at that time I was teaching at CCS, and you just can't find the information. You're like, I want to know what year was this, what was it for? And so once somebody does that archival work of putting it together in a book, then you have it. And similarly, like in 2020, a new history of Arab graphic design came out that like before, they compiled all these posters that I didn't even know existed. And then you see these things and you're like, this has been going on there was a lot of production in the 70s that I didn't know about. So I think that cataloging things into a book, as much as we sort of love the digital stuff, there's also this ephemerality where you just put it out on Instagram and you're like, you like it and then you forget. But if it's in a book, you can kind of reference it back and make sense of it and then teach it. So.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, because I was thinking of other books that had come out. Your own book on the printing co-op, for example, that suddenly exposed this whole idea of like, well, yeah, there were printing cooperatives, just like there were media cooperatives. So you would share equipment, you share expenses, and it was in the 70s, so print was a primary means of communication for most people. So it's a form of empowerment, but also sharing and resource sharing, which I think also translates to a younger generation's like interest in like printing, et cetera. Because in the printing co-op book, and with Freddie, he was very much a printer, and so he was a designer too. And there's the form, the use of color, all of that stuff seemed really resonant to contemporary interests by students in a kind of, I wouldn't know if it's style of graphic design, but a method of production of graphic design. And I'm wondering if that's also not part of what is fueling this. But I think a lot of it goes back to this idea of allyship. And one of the things I write about in the book, which I think is the thorniest thing to unpack, which it always is for design, graphic design, is what the great theorist Craig Owens once called the indignity of speaking for others. And it's this idea of representing. It's like when you're not part of that culture, when you're not part of that history, and you're producing images for that population. Of course, this is part and parcel about being a designer, because you're often not your own message. You're being hired to communicate other people's messages to other people. But in the art world, it's almost verboten now to think that you could speak for somebody else. And I'm wondering, I'm kind of throwing a bomb out there, but how you might begin to address that. Is it as simple as, well, it's design, it could be there. I know that there was, from what I've read, there was a little bit of trepidation from some of the Cuban designers. You brought up the one example, which I had not seen before, from North Korea, for instance. Like, yeah, we don't want that. We're going to go with our state-sponsored style. Right.
It produced both of those.
Oh, okay.
But, there's a lot of great stories about posters that never made it. But the issue of representation is even more fraught than ever, because people are more aware than ever. Mm-hmm. Things that might have passed, back in the long 60s would never fly now. You look at like Zap Comics and the misogyny and this stuff. It's like, oh my God. It was a laugh riot back in 1972. Nowadays it's like, So we've learned, we evolve as as the world changes and as political movements change, and as people are able to more articulate voices that represent themselves. So there's a shift in how propaganda happens, who gets to make that statement, and there's an increasing volume of work coming from the voices themselves, from below, in ways that, because they have more of the tools, there's more support for that. You used the word allyship. We used to use the word solidarity. There's a lot of shifting in how people represent broader causes that are more authentic than they probably used to be. And so that's a mm-hmm. positive thing. Yeah. We've learned a lot.
Excellent. I don't know if you've encountered that in your courses, in your teaching.
Do you mean like designers representing other?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes, but I think I guess I just always think of advertising for some reason, where I think that it's that, because I think that with a lot of, this is sort of off the top of my head, but I think with a lot of political work, a lot of times the designers, if you're doing that kind of work, you're not getting paid probably for it. So it's like authentic, like it's like mission driven. You're like, I'm a socialist, so I'm gonna make socialist posters. So you're not necessarily like doing it for cash. Whereas if you're designing like the FedEx poster that's going to be in Saudi Arabia, you're like, maybe you're doing it from your office in Germany or something. And I think that kind of thing happens a lot in the corporate sphere. But yeah, so I do think about that sometimes when I'm teaching graphic design. You talk about like just sort of things getting translated or like how they kind of operate in different places. But I don't know if that really kind of answers the question or addresses.
No, it's just genuinely
Yeah.
curious because I think it's one of the big conundrums, and it's always been a big conundrum. But I appreciate those questions.
But I do like, I mean, it
answers.
is cool to see, for instance, this is I guess, this is about Vietnam made by Cuban artists, right? So I feel like that's, or is yeah, but or like the idea of like doing these things in solidarity with someone else's,
Right.
like social justice movement. I mean, I think there's a way in which that can really work well. It can
But
be
this,
great.
I mean, Cuba really, Cuba is one of the few countries in the world that had really, this similar history, fighting, the U.S. opposing it, strong solidarity with the Vietnamese. The two trips that Remedios took to Vietnam were like heartbreaking. You see him doing these posters about women in tunnels, welding, tables for hospitals, and children learning lessons in bomb shelters, and you really see the war from another side. The Cubans really, I think, politically understood the war in a way that it was even harder for U.S., for Jane Fonda to do, because the Cubans had experienced this. So that authenticity was there. It's harder now. You don't see a lot of posters about. Used to be there were posters from Cuba support, Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Well, the PLO supported a two-state solution. Things were different back then. You don't see posters about support Hamas. So things are complicated.
Very much so. I think we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions as well. If there are any questions we could tackle.
I will bring you this microphone if you'd like to ask a question, but I actually do want to start the question with a question that I was asked yesterday, because I think it's actually useful based on the conversation that I've heard today. I was giving a tour of the posters in the galleries, and something that someone asked me is like, how did they have the Arabic script that is included, right? There's 4 languages on all the Oswald posters. And I sort of went down a rabbit hole with this person trying to explain to them like how the organization worked and how it functioned and how they learned from each other and how they communicated across time, like without the use of the internet, which people don't seem to be able to imagine anymore at all. So I'm just curious, Lincoln or Andrew, if you could talk a little bit more about the organization of OSPAL and maybe some of the conferences at the beginning and sort of how communication was occurring and how they were able to sort of like make those translations beyond themselves, really think beyond themselves as an organization.
I think
within
Lincoln probably could answer the
Well,
direct question.
There's a fairly large Arabic community in Havana. And so it's not like it's this totally foreign thing. I mean, there were people there who were able to write this, and there were people who were sort of politically affiliated with what OSPAL was doing that would jump in. They had paid staff. They also had people who were just part of their broader community who were doing this. So they would, often it was hand calligraphy. They would do it, but it was imperfect. There's one example I've got where they did the translation wrong, and so but it took someone. I couldn't read this, but they said, "Oh yeah, that says the wrong thing." So it's an imperfect process, but you're cranking a poster out. Mistakes happen, but they did have a community of people on site helping to produce this stuff. And I mean, one thing is this is all on a shoestring, right? This is not a big, highly paid operation. I mean, some of these things, I talked to Rosgard about that one about Santo Domingo. I asked him, well, how did you make that really cool sort of airbrush? Oh no, we didn't have airbrushes. I got a toothbrush, I put some ink on it, and went like that. I mean, this is old school, simple hand techniques to produce these posters. This was really technically very crude, but very effective, but there was a lot of political connection, and people were constantly saying, oh yeah, let's make sure we get this right.
I should probably explain, like, OSPAL itself is like the Organization for Solidarity of Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, so it's an acronym. And it's a successor organization in a way to a conference that was held in Indonesia in the late 1950s, which was a gathering of largely, it was heavily Asia and African countries who gathered after World War II when the superpowers were dividing up the world. This is when a lot of countries fought for or asked for their independence. And so there were a lot of new countries emerging. There's something like 100 new countries are added during that period of when OSPAL, was functioning in the early days. So there was a whole movement for, anti-colonial, empowerment and solidarity with other countries doing that. And because Cuba was so successful and very photogenic in a way, mediagenic. Castro knew exactly what he was doing in terms of being able to play to the media. So the Cuban Revolution becomes the revolution, right? This is the example. And so he asked for OSPAL to be headquartered in Havana. And so it's technically a non-governmental organization, but it was heavily funded by the Cuban government. And you're totally right about the graphic means of production, but the fact that they were printing in color was also an indication of like how much money they were willing to put towards spreading their messages around the world in the quest around the world. And that was a key thing. That's why Che is found in Bolivia. He's trying to liberate other Latin American countries. They're a big presence in Angola as well, in Southern Africa, to fight for independence.
Yeah, let me speak to Angola and South Africa because, the U.S. was on the wrong side of that. We were not supporting the African National Congress. U.S. corporations were sending, arms to South Africa. We were investing in South Africa, and so there's a huge local resistance. Campuses all over the country were saying, divest from South Africa. So there was pushback against U.S. foreign policy, but Cuba was sort of doing the right thing, and Nelson Mandela was really grateful for Cuban support. Angola is an example where, we talk about the Cuba sort of being a pawn of the Soviet Union, but the Soviets did not like Cuba's intervention in Angola. They saw this as troublemaking, but Fidel felt it was really important because of the legacy of the slave trade. And so he felt politically this was something that they needed to do. It was not a popular war. I know a lot of people in Cuba who did not want to go off and fight that war, but I didn't want to go off and fight Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Might be one.
Thank you. I just was kind of reflecting on the political posters and the graphics in sort of a through line to ETG from the farm workers, El Taller Gráfico, the work of the farm workers that sort of took on a life of its own with its imagery and iconic images. I wonder if there was a connection among the artists, like Ocampo or the other artists in some of the Cuban art. I know that the farm workers were not openly as radical, but the UFW had its own sort of imagery as well.
Cesar Chavez was pretty anti-communist.
Right.
But as you saw with that one graphic I showed you from El Grito del Norte in New Mexico, there was a broader solidarity back and forth between things. But the farm workers were not as clearly linked with what was going on in Cuba as the Panthers, for example. But
yeah, no, I would agree. Question?
Hi. So I board at the upper school here at Cranbrook. I'm also Vietnamese, and hearing this talk, I came up with this question. With the artwork that Bianco and people like him created, were they able to see their impact for example, the anti-war movement in America, against its war in Vietnam during the 1970s?
Mm-hmm. I think.
question is.
I think like seeing the impact, were the Cuban designers able to see their impact of their work? I don't know if that was at the time or later, because I know later, for sure, I think.
I believe that they did, as we did, that every effort to try to end U.S. intervention in this war ended up being successful. The historical consequences of that are a different thing, but in terms of ending the U.S. war in Vietnam, all of these campaigns, from France and England and Cuba and Chile, they were all trying to end this war, and that succeeded. So, ultimately it was the Vietnamese people themselves that won the war, but the pressure that was brought on the U.S. government was overwhelming when bodies started to come home on television and people started to realize that this was not what we thought we were getting into. But the graphic elements that you see here were all part of that campaign from various sides to try to end this war, and they succeeded.
I know there was some contact between like some of the countries where the posters had gone to, and some of those delegations traveling to Havana would be my guess, and that the designers were able to ask some of those questions that I was asking, like, is it okay to represent you, basically? And the answer that they got, and of course this is history and self-interest talking, but what they said was that, yes, that was a very powerful thing for people fighting abroad to be able to see the solidarity and the allyship with what they were undertaking. And then oftentimes those posters and those styles became the de facto way to communicate for those groups in those countries. So there was feedback that was given in a positive sense for what they were doing.
This question is, I guess, primarily for Danielle. As an educator, I'm interested for your perspective on, what is it about kind of studying this particular type of work and kind of the context surrounding it, as far as helping to educate and develop, designers that are, just kind of starting out their practices and their careers. And obviously it's beautiful work, but, I'm curious to hear your perspective on, what some of those most important takeaways are for being able to share and kind of talk about this with students.
Yeah, I think that, I think as, as artists, sometimes you're really wondering where to situate your work. You're like, what's the point of what I'm doing? And then specifically as graphic designers, when you're doing a lot of commercial work, you have that question even more. You're like, why am I making this ad for a realtor? What systems am I upholding here? So then I think when I'm teaching graphic design and I'm teaching, people who are going to go into the profession, I think a lot about my own experience of that, just feeling kind of that there's a way in which you have so much power if you're able to produce compelling images. And I think actually this kind of goes to your question as well, is what impact do you have? A lot of times it feels like you have zero impact. I think when there's these moments of great urgency, like you're watching all these people getting killed on, day after day, and you're just like, what can I do? What tools do I have at my disposal? And you're good at just you're just capturing. There's something sort of poetic about it. You're capturing this moment. You're trying to kind of humanize something, or you're trying to make a political point that'll change the way people think about it. And I think that's where, as graphic designers, you actually have this very specific skill set. So when I teach students, I know most of them, I'm actually hoping, hoping they can get a job at Quicken, or they can get a full-time job afterward, and they can go wherever. But I want them to also think critically about their abilities, and also the interventions they can make in the process wherever they're at. So I know also at different stages of life you just have more or less autonomy. So sometimes you're really just working for someone else. You got to put your head down and do that. But if you can on the weekend make a poster and feel like this is going to have some kind of impact, or make a graphic. Even if, I mean, a lot of my students, at Wayne State, I've watched them be like really politicized in the last couple of years. I mean, I would actually say it's been going on for like the last 10 years, because when I started teaching there, it was not really like a politicized campus, but you see them making posters for events, and like, how can they get people out to that event? And then you're really thinking about the role that graphics play in just drawing people in, trying to present the message in a certain way. So I think that, I think that I've gone back and forth where you feel like, oh, it's pointless. We're just sort of glorifying these like political things as if we make a difference. But I think recently, I really think you do make a difference. It's like all systems go. What can you do as a designer? What can you do as an artist to kind of shift the politics? And I also will say, like, teaching, that's the one time you can really talk about this stuff. Once you're in the workplace, it's not going to come up probably in your at your office job. So you just want to kind of I try to make students aware of this, and also just encourage them to think for themselves. Like, make your own decisions about what you think about what's going on. But yeah.
I've got one example that I think helps to sort of illuminate the impact of this kind of work, which is during the Occupy movement in 2011, one of my friends had a screen print table set up down in the downtown Oakland, and there were thousands of people all over the place, and he was screen printing these posters, and the line for people to get a poster was longer than the line for people to get food. People would take this poster home that they saw an actual artist make. They would take that home, and in a week or a year or 10 years, they'd say, I was there. It locks you into the moment, and it gives you agency, that you were part of something bigger than yourself. And that's what we can hope for.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. And check out the show if you haven't seen it.